Hi there, my name's Danny. This is the 8th module of 10 that I'll be sharing here on YouTube from my full course on Quasar Framework version 1. Welcome to this course module. So far we can display a list of tasks on the page with a name, due date and due time, and we can delete a task. In this module we're going to add the ability to add a task. So we're going to stick an add task button on the page. When the user clicks that, we're going to have a modal shown. In that modal we're going to have a form with the fields for name, due date and due time. We're going to add form validation to that form, the ability to submit that form, and then we're going to use Vuex to add the new task to the state and to the view. Let's add the ability to add a task now. So first of all, I'd like a nice big round button down here that's always docked to the bottom that the user can click in order to show the add task modal. So let's jump to the Quasar site and look for a nice round button. So we want to go to View Components, then Buttons. Now I'll just scroll down. This one looks pretty good. So I'm just going to click on View Source and grab the code for that button. Now we want to stick this on the To Do page. So let's open up Source, Pages, Page To Do. And I'll stick this at the bottom of the page here. I'll remove this v4 and key property. And I'll remove these colons from the size and icon props. Set the size to 24 pixels. And we're going to need an icon for this. So let's jump to the material icons site. And we'll search for add. See what we can find. This one looks pretty good. So class name is just add. So I'll stick that in the icon prop here on this button. Save that. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now I want to have this docked to the bottom. So how can we do that? Well, Quasar has lots of classes for handling positioning. And you can find these on the, if you go to Style and Identity and then Positioning. So there's loads of different classes here. We could use this absolute bottom class to fix it to the bottom. So let's surround this button in a div with the class absolute bottom. And I also want this button to be centered within that. So let's add the text center class as well. Save that. Let's add a little bit of margin so it's not stuck right to the bottom. So we can just do that with the Quasar margin classes. So Q-M, B for bottom, dash LG for large. Save that. Okay, that's looking pretty good now. Now we need a modal to display, a dialog. So we've used the dialog plugin before, but in this case we want to use a dialog as a component, so that we can really make changes to it and add all the fields that we need and all the functionality we need as well. So let's jump to the Quasar site, go to Components and then Dialog. Okay, so it tells us what we need to install. We need to add QDialog to the components array and close popup to the directives array. So let's open up quasar.conf.js and we'll add these in. So we'll add QDialog to the components list and then close popup to the directives list. Save that. So we're just going to grab the markup for a basic dialog like this alert and we'll customize it later. So I'm going to click View Source here, grab the code for that alert dialog. Copy that and I'll paste this at the bottom of this Q page element. Save that. And this vModal prop on this QDialog, this basically determines whether this dialog is showing or not. So if the property this refers to is true, then the dialog will be shown. If it's false, then the dialog will not be shown. So we'll set up a data property to handle this. And we'll call that show add task. And now down in the script section, we can create a data function which returns an object. And we can add a property for that in here. So it's called show add task. And we'll set that to true to begin with. Save that. Okay, we can kind of see a dialog, but it looks a bit messed up. We might have some components missing from the config file. So if we look in the console, yeah, we have 3 unknown custom elements here: QCard, QCard section, and QCard actions. So let's add these to the Quasar conf file. So QCard section, and QCard actions. Save that. Okay, that's looking pretty good now. So now if I jump back to page to do, if we set this show add task property to false, then the dialog disappears. And we want it to be hidden to begin with, so let's leave it as false. And we want this to show when we click this button. So let's add a click handler to that button, which is here, at click equals, and we can just set show add task to true. Save that. Now when we click this button, this dialog is shown. Okay, so this dialog is going to get quite complicated. We're going to have a lot of elements within that and a lot of functionality to handle form validation and form submission, etc. So let's put this into its own child component. So I'm going to copy this QCard element. In fact, I'll cut that. And we'll create a new child component where this can go. So within components and tasks, let's create a folder called Modals. And within that, we'll create a file called add_task.vue. We'll add the template and script sections, and then I'll just paste that markup in there. Fix the indentation. Save that. Now back to the page to do file. We need to import this component. So down in the components object here, I'll just duplicate that task one. Now I want the HTML tag to be add task. So let's just change that to add task. And then point to the correct component, which is at components, tasks, modals / add task. Save that. And now to stick that on the page, we can just simply add an add task element to the page like that. Save that. Okay, let's click the button. Okay, great. So the modal is still showing, except now the contents of this modal, this dialog, are now within this child component, add task. So let's customize this modal a little bit. So that it's always showing, I'm just going to jump to page to do.vue and change show add task to true. So that as we're making changes to it, we don't have to keep clicking the add task button. And then we'll jump to our child component, add task.vue. And I'll change the title here to add task. Save that. And I'd like to have a close button on this up in the corner. So let's jump to the Quasar site and grab a button. So buttons, button. And we're just going to use a flat rounded one like this with an icon. So I'm going to view the source on that, grab the code, and I'll stick that underneath the heading. Save that. Okay, we now have this icon. I'm going to break these attributes up. I'm going to add a dense prop to make it take up a bit less space. I'm going to remove the color prop so that it's just black. And now let's find a close icon for this. So we'll jump to the material icons page, search for close. There we go. That looks pretty good. Class name is close. So Let's change this icon prop to close. Save that. Now we want this to be over in the right hand corner here. So what we can do is this QCard section, which surrounds this heading and button, we can add a row class to that. And items within a row will be side by side. However, now the button is right next to this heading. We want it right over here. Well, there's a really handy Quasar component called the space component, which will fill the space between elements within a row. So let's jump back to the Quasar site and find this space component. There it is, space. We need to install it first, so let's jump to quasar.conf.js, add it to the list, q space, and now we can just stick a q space component between this heading and this button, which will fill out that space between them. Q dash space, save that. Okay, that's looking pretty good. However, when we click that, it doesn't do anything. Well, we can use a Quasar directive to make this close the modal. So if we go to the Quasar site and then to View Directives, I think we want this close pop-up directive. Okay, so we need to install this. So we need to add close pop-up to the directives list in the config file. Oh, that's already there, so we don't need to add that. So to use this, let's just scroll down to the bottom. We can just add this v-close-pop-up directive to our close button. So let's just add that. So to this q-button element, I'm just going to add v-close-pop-up. Save that. Let's see if that works. Great, so that's now closing the pop-up. Now I'm just going to change this OK button to save. So that button's here, so let's just change the label to save. I'm going to break up these attributes. Save that. Okay, that's looking pretty good now. Now we can add some fields to this dialog. Let's add some fields to this pop-up. So we're going to need fields for the name, the due date, and the due time. But before we add these fields, let's set up a data property to hold these fields for us before we send them on to our store where they'll be added to the state. So down in the script section, let's add our data function which returns the object. And let's create an object to hold these fields for us. So we could call it task2submit. So what are the fields that we need in here? Well, if we jump back to our store file, which is in store, and then it's store-tasks. These are the fields we need: name, completed, due date, and due time. So I'm just going to copy these from there, paste them into this task to submit object. I'm going to move completed down to the bottom because this is less relevant here because it's always going to be false. And I'll set all the other ones to empty strings to begin with. Okay, so let's add some fields now. So we'll jump to the Quasar site. We want to go to View Components, Form Components, and then Input Text field. Now we need to install this, so I'll add qinput to the config file. Save that. Let's find one. I like this outlined one here, so I'm going to click on View Source, grab the code for that outlined input. Copy that. And we'll paste it within this QCard section here, which currently just has this lorem ipsum text in it. So I'll delete that text, paste in that input. I'll break up the attributes. Save that. Okay, so we now have an input on the page. I'm going to change this label. Whoops. I'm going to change this label to task name. And this vModal we need to bind this input to the name field down here in this task to submit object. So we can just change this vModal to task to submit dot name. Save that. Just to check that's working, I'll just stick a name in here down in the object. Yep, that's working. I'll set that back to an empty string now. Okay, so now we need a field for the due date. So we'll jump back to the Quasar site. We want to go to form components and date picker. Now we need to install this component, so we need to add QDate to the config. So I'll add that in. Save that. Now if we scroll down to the bottom here, we want an input which has a pop-up where you can choose your date. So we're going to use this one here with Q input. So I'm going to click on view source, grab the code for that, and we'll paste that under the name input. Fix the indentation. I'm going to break up these attributes. I'm going to remove this mask attribute and remove this rules attribute. I'll explain about rules later on. Let's see how that's looking. Okay, we have an error here. A couple of errors. One of them is unknown custom element Q pop-up proxy. So we need to add a component called Q pop-up proxy to the components array in the config. Okay. So now to bind this date input to our due date field down here, we need to update two vModals. One on the input itself and one on the pop-up. So these vModals, I'm just going to change those to task to submit dot due date. Save that. Okay. That seems to be working. We can now choose a date and that gets added to the field. But this field doesn't look like the other one, so I'm going to get rid of this filled prop and change that to outlined. So it's the same as the first input. Save that. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Now we need a time input. So let's jump back to the Quasar site. Go to components, form components, time picker. Now we need to add this component to the config, QTime. So I'll add that to Quasar config. Now scroll down to the bottom. We'll look for an input which has a time picker. There we go. Click view source and I'll grab the code for that and I'll stick it under this date input. Fix the indentation. Okay. And again, we have two vModals here that we need to bind to our due time field down here in the task to submit object. So we'll change these vModals to task to submit dot due time. I'm going to break up these attributes. Again, I'm going to change filled to outlined so they all look the same. And I'm going to get rid of the mask and rules attributes. Save that. Okay, let's see if that works. Yeah, time picker appears. We can choose a time. That's good. Now these are all a bit squished together, so let's add a bit of space between them. So we can just surround each of these Q input elements in a row with some bottom padding applied to each one. So we'll create a row with a class of Q-MB for margin bottom -SM for small. And we'll surround each input in a div with these classes. So div.row.QMB SM. And finally the time field. row.qnb-sm. Save that. Okay, that's looking a bit better. For some reason, this name field isn't stretching all the way across. So we can fix that by turning this Q input element into a column. So we can just add a class to that of col, class equals col. Save that. Okay, that's looking a bit better. We need labels on these date and time fields. So let's add a label prop to each one. So first the date field. So label, set that to due date. And then we'll add a label to the time input as well. Label equals due time. Save that. Okay, great. So now we have inputs for all of the fields that we need in order to add a new task. The name, the due date, and the due time. When the user clicks this Save button, we want to validate these fields before we send the data to our store, where the task will be added to the state. So let's add some validation. The due date and due time fields are optional, but the task name is not. We need a task name. So let's add some validation to this field. So if we jump back to the Quasar site and go to components, form components, and then input text field again. And then over on the right here, if we click validation, and we can see an example here for a required field. So if we blur on this field while it's empty, we get this error message. So let's click on the View Source button. And you can see this rules prop here. So let's copy that rules prop and we'll add it to our Q input. So that's here. Stick that there, save that. And now if I leave this field empty and I click out of it, we get this error message. If I enter something, the error message disappears. So we need to be able to submit this form in some way. So let's surround all of our fields inside a form element. So I'm going to create a form element here. And I'm going to stick all of this Q card section, which contains the 3 fields, as well as this Q card actions section, which contains the save button, inside that form element. So I'm going to cut that and paste it all inside this form. Just nudge it all back. Now, how can we listen to the submit event of this form element? Well, remember in Vue.js we can add event handlers for all of the different JavaScript events. And form elements have a submit event, so we can listen to that by just adding a @submit handler. And within that we can just call a method. So we'll create a method called submit form. And down in the script section, we'll create a method for that down here. So we'll create our methods object first, and then create our method submit form. I'll just log out submit form so we can see if it's working. Save that. And I'll clear the console and click the save button. Oh, it's not submitting the form right now. So if we look at the save button, it doesn't have a type equals submit. So let's add that to this element, type equals submit. And it's also closing this pop-up when we click it. And that's because it has this vclose pop-up directive on it. So we'll remove that as well. Save that. Clear the console. Click the save button. It reloaded the page here. Why is that? Well, that's because the default action of a form submit is to send some data to another page or the same page and reload that page. So to stop that happening, on this submit handler on the form, we can add a modifier by adding .prevent, which will prevent the default action of that event. So now the page should not be reloaded. Let's just try that. Click save. Okay, the page is no longer reloaded, and if we look in the console, we can see submit form is being logged out. So this method is being successfully fired. Now, when this method is fired, we want to validate this field. So if we jump back to the Quasar site, and on this import page, if we click down to Queue Import API, and within here, methods, we have this validate method, which we can trigger on a queue import element to check whether it's valid. But how can we actually fire this method on our import element? Well, we can use a ref to do that. So we'll jump up to the name input and we'll add a ref prop. And we'll call it name. And then down in the submit form method, to fire this validate method on this queue import, we can just do this .refs.name, so that's the name we used for the ref, .validate. Save that. I'll clear the console, and now if I click save, you can see the field gets validated. So how can we check if this is valid or not before we actually send this data on to our store? Well, let's just log out this .refs.name, see what we can see in there. Okay, so I'll click save again. We can see this object in there. So let's open that up, scroll down, and we can see this has error property. And that is currently set to true because there is an error. However, if I enter a task name, clear the console, click save again, open that object, scroll down to has error, it's now set to false. So we can use this to determine whether this field is valid. So what we can do is we can add a if statement. So we can do if this.refs.name.has error. Actually, we want to check if it doesn't have an error. If it doesn't have an error, then we can submit the task data to our store. So if there's no error on that field, we'll call a method called submit task. And we'll create that method down here, submit task. And I'll just log out submit task in there. I'll remove this other console.log, save that, make sure that's working. Okay, clear the console. So if I click save now, then we shouldn't see this submit task log being triggered. Save that. No, we don't see it. But if I enter a task name, click save, you can see the submit task log being fired. Okay, just while I'm here, I've noticed this save button isn't very prominent on this form. So I'm just going to jump to that button and remove this flat prop to make it just a bit more prominent. Okay, so all of our validation is working now. We just need to send our task data to the store where we can add the new task to the state. So when the user fills in these fields, the name, the due date, and the due time, the corresponding fields in this task to submit object will be updated with the same information. When the user hits save, this submit form method is fired. We validate the form, and if it's valid, we fire this submit task method. So at this point, we want to send this task to our store and then add it to the state. So how can we do that? Well, we can just trigger an action within this submit task method. And we can send this task to submit object to that action. So let's just create that action now. So we want to open up store tasks.js and we'll add a new action called add task. And we'll pass in the commit method so we can fire a corresponding mutation. And what we're going to pass to this, we're going to pass a task to this. So I won't call it payload, I'll call it task. So within this add task action, we have the task data, but we're also going to need an ID because each of our tasks, remember, is contained in an object. The key of that object is a unique ID. So we need to generate a unique ID somehow. So how can we do that? Well, if we jump to the Quasar site, scroll down to Quasar utils and then other utils, we have this generate UID utility, which will generate a unique string like this, which is just a bunch of numbers and letters. So first of all, we need to import this UID utility. So at the top of the store tasks.js, we'll import UID from Quasar. And then to use it, we can just fire this UID method. So we can just set up a variable, let's call it task ID, and we can just fire UID to get that unique ID. So we need to send this ID and the new task data to our mutation so that it can add it to the state. So let's set up a payload which contains both of those. We'll call it payload, and this will be an object with a property called ID, which will be set to this unique ID we've just generated here. And the second property will be for the task data, which we're passing in here from our add task component. And then we can just commit our mutation. So we can just do commit, name of the mutation, and we'll call it the same name, add task. And then the data we want to pass to that, which is payload. Now we can just create our mutation, add task, pass in the state, and pass in that payload that's coming from the action. We want to create a new object which has the ID as the key and then the data within that. Now, when we add a new object to the state, we need to use a special Vue method to do this so that the data in that state remains reactive. A bit like we did with the delete here, Vue.delete. And we can use the VueSet method. So we can just do Vue.set. First parameter is the object we want to add to, which is state.tasks. The second parameter is the key of the new object we're going to add, which is going to be, remember, payload.id. So payload.id. And then we pass in the data we want to store there, which will be payload.tasks. Save that. Now we're not currently triggering this action, so back in add task, we'll map the add task method to this component using map actions. So you want to do import map actions from Vuex, and then in the methods object we can add ... map actions. Now we're mapping an action from the tasks store module, and the action we want to map is add task. So this action is now mapped to this component, so we can just trigger this now. So down in this submit task method, we can just do this.add task and pass in this task to submit object. So this.task to submit. Save that. Okay, so let's see if that works now. Get oranges. I'll pick a due date and a due time. Click Save. So we have an error here. It says, cannot read property completed of undefined. Let's have a look in the state and see what's going on. So you want to open Vue.js DevTools, go to Vuex, and we can see it's triggered the add task mutation. Let's click on that. And then we go down to state. And this shows us what the state looks like after this add task mutation is fired. So we'll open up tasks. You can see it's added a new task there with a unique ID, but there's nothing contained within it. It says undefined. So I think we've gone wrong in our store file. So let's open up store tasks. Let's have a look at the add task mutation. And we're doing view.set state.tasks, payload ID, payload task. Yeah, this is wrong. I've put payload.tasks and it should be just payload.task. So I'll change that to payload.task, save that, and we'll try that again. Get oranges, due date, due time, click save. Great. Although the dialog is still visible, you can see that it's added this new task. So that's pretty good. So how can we get this dialog to disappear after this form is submitted? Well, we can do this using custom events. What we can do is, let's jump to the add task.vue file. After we fire that action, we can emit an event, and we can give this event any name we like, and then we can listen to that event on the page to do page on this add task element here. So within add task.vue, after we've fired the add task action, we'll emit an event, and we can do that by adding this $emit, and then we can give this event a name. I'm going to call it close. Now if we jump back to page to do.vue, down to the add task element, we can listen to that event here by just simply adding @close. And then we can either fire a method or just fire a line of JavaScript inside these quotes. So to hide this modal, we can just simply set show add task to false. So within these quotes, we can just add show add task equals false. So when the form gets submitted, it gets validated, then this submit task method is fired. Then we fire the action, which adds the new task to the state. Then we emit a custom event, which we can listen to in this page to do.vue here. And then we can fire this JavaScript when that event is received to set show add task back to false, thus hiding the modal. So let's see if that's working now. So I'll add another task. Save that. Okay, that seems to be working now. The modal now disappears after the form is submitted. Now before we move on, I'm just going to clear out all the default tasks. So I'm going to jump to store tasks.js and I'm just going to comment out these tasks. I won't delete it though, I'll just comment it out so we have a reference of what all the field names should be. Save that. Okay, this add task modal is still being shown by default. So back in the page to do file, let's set show add task to false. So it's only shown when we click the add task button. Okay, so now our app starts off empty and we can add tasks to it from there. Okay, so before we move on to the next module, I just want to add a few little improvements. So when this modal is shown, it would be good if this task name field auto-focused so that the user doesn't have to click into it every time they want to add a new task. Now we created a custom directive to do this back in the Vue.js basics module. However, if we go to the Quasar site and then to form components, input text field, jump down to QInput API, and props and then behavior, we have this autofocus prop for QInput elements, which will autofocus it. So if we jump to add task.view and find this name input, which is here, we can just add a autofocus prop to this input. Save that. Just refresh the page and click add task. Okay, so that field is now auto-focusing. Now, if we just close this modal, you can see when there's no tasks on the page, we have this line here. So let's just jump to page-to-do.view. And we have this QList component, which contains all of our tasks within it. And the reason we have this line there is because this QList component is being shown even if there are no tasks inside it. So what we could do is we could just hide this QList component completely if there are no tasks. So how can we do that? Well, we could add a VIF directive to it. Now, our data is stored in an object. So we could check whether this object is empty or not. So how could we do that? Well, we could use the object.keys method, which will return the keys in that object as an array. So for this one here, it would return an array with ID1, ID2, and ID3. And then we can then count that array to determine whether or not this tasks object is empty. So back on the page to do file, on this QList and this VIF directive, we could add, so VIF object.keys tasks. So this will give us an array of all the keys that are inside this tasks object. So then we can just do .length. So if the tasks object is empty, then this will be 0, which is a falsy value. And if there's at least one task, then it will return 1 or more, which is a truthy value. So let's just save that. Okay, that line now disappears. So if we add a task now, make sure it still displays when there are tasks. Go to shop, save. Yep, that's looking a bit better now. Now let's click on the add task button, and we have a due date field and a due time field. Well, we don't want the user to be able to enter a due time unless they've already selected a due date. So it'd be good if we could hide this due time unless a due date has been entered. So let's jump to the add task component and find this due time field. What we could do on this row that surrounds it, we could just put v-if task to submit dot due date. In other words, only show this due time row if a due date has been entered. So I'll save that. Okay, so now the due time field has disappeared. And if I choose a date, then we see the due time field appear again. Okay, so let's just add another task now. Get bananas, and we'll add a due date and a due time. Click save. Okay, so this task we just added looks okay, but this first task, where we didn't choose a due date or a due time, we still have this calendar icon. So how can we make that disappear if the user hasn't entered a date? Let's jump to task.view, which is in components, task, and then task.view. And we'll look for the section which contains this calendar icon and these two fields, which is here, this Q item section component. So we can just hide this completely. So we can just add v-if task.dueDate In other words, only display this section if there is a due date. I'll save that. And we can now see the calendar icon disappear from the first item. Okay, so let's open up our Add Task modal. These fields, it'd be good if they had a clear button, which the user can click to clear these fields. So let's jump back to the Quasar site, to Components, Form Components, Input Text Field. And we'll see if we can find an input which has a clear button. Okay, here's one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's the 8th one down, so I'll click on View Source. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so this one has this template inside it with vslot append, and inside that you can see the close icon there. So I'm just going to copy this bit and throw it into one of our inputs. So we want to open up the add task.view and look for the name input, which is this one. And I'm going to add a closing tag to this queue input and then paste in that code. Okay, let's see how that looks. Okay, we can now see a close button here. I'm just going to split up these attributes. Now we only want to show this icon if a name has been entered. So we could just add a quick vif task to submit dot name. So if there's a name, then show this close icon. Save that. Okay, so it now disappears. If we enter something into this name field, we can now see this close icon. If we clear it, then it disappears again. So we want to clear this field when the user clicks this clear button. So let's add a click handler to it. So @click equals, and we just want to set task to submit dot name back to an empty string. Save that. Oh, it's gone wrong there. Duplicate attribute click. Oh, it already has a click handler on it, this one. So I'll just remove that. Save. Okay, now if I click this, the field gets cleared. Okay, so let's do the same on the due date field. So I'll copy this template bit, and then we'll go down to the due date queue input. On this one already has this template with vslot append. So I'm just going to copy the queue icon and stick that within here. So I'll stick that there, save that, and we'll change the vif to if task to submit dot due date has a value. Save that. Okay, now if we choose a due date, we can now see this close icon. In fact, it would look better if it was to the left of this calendar icon. So I'm going to move this queue icon up above the other icon. Save that. Okay, that's a bit better. Now when this one is clicked, we want to clear this due date field, but we also want to clear this due time field because we don't want users to be able to submit a due time without a due date. So within this click handler, we will fire a method, and let's call it clear due date. And we'll create that method in methods, clear due date, and we'll set this dot task to submit dot due date back to an empty string, and we'll also set this dot task to submit dot due time back to an empty string. Save that. Okay, so let's enter a due date. We'll enter a due time. Now if I click on this clear button, okay, everything's now cleared. Okay, we also want a clear button on this due time field. So let's go and find the clear button from the due date one, which is here. And we'll copy that into the due time queue input within this template tag. Okay. Now we only want to show this icon if a time has been entered. So if task to submit dot due time. And if the user clicks this, we only want to clear the due time field. So inside this click handler, we'll just do task to submit dot due time equals an empty string. Save that. Okay, so let's see if that works. I'll choose a due date, choose a due time. Okay, we can now see the clear button. I'll click that. That's not working. Okay, it's because I've used two equal signs here. It should just be one. Let's try that again. I'll click the clear button on this due time field. Okay, that's now being cleared. For some reason, this input is going a bit smaller than the others when that close button is not being displayed. So I'm just going to add a class of call to this queue input to make it stretch out to fill the row. So on this queue import, I'll add class equals call. Save that. Just make sure that's working. Choose a due date. Yeah, this seems to be stretching across now. Choose a due time. Okay, you can see all the clear buttons now. Let's see if they all work. Yeah, they're all working. Great. So that concludes our add task functionality. Thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe and leave a comment to let me know what you think. And if you're interested in the full course, click the link in the description. In the next video, we're going to add the ability to edit a task by reusing some of the components we built for the add task modal.